Scotland might become the home for an ambitious global initiative to place values at the heart of the financial world. The Faith Consistent Investment Alliance would aim to shift billions of pounds of faith-based investments into supporting sustainable development and the environment. It has a potential to change the face of capitalism. Martin Palmer is Secretary General of ARC, the Alliance of Religions and Conservations, and Omar Shaikh is from the Islamic Finance Council UK. Along with the Church of Scotland, both are key players behind this new faith-consistent investment alliance. And joining us is Professor Alison Phipps, practical theologian and member of the Iona community. And good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Omar, what's the thinking behind this new alliance?
Well, obviously, since the banking crisis, a lot of people in society have come out and questioned the nature of our financial markets. And through this, it's also inspired the faith groups as well to also come out and say, well, actually, how can we manage our money in a way which is more socially responsible and systemically stable? So within this context, the UKIFC, us along with the Church of Scotland, years ago established this initiative, which is to create the world's first joint venture between Islamic finance and the church, which is to create, aims to create an practical ethical finance solution open to everyone in society, regardless of race, religion, or ethnic background, but based on the shared values between the faith traditions.
Martin, what's different about this? It's bringing people and organisations together to talk about what they believe and want to support, but what are they not against? What are they for?
Well, that's the big shift. The faiths all around the world, and we're working with faiths from Buddhism through to Shintoism, working with about 550 religious investment houses around the world, roughly representing about $3.5 trillion worth of faith investment. And there's a long tradition of what faiths are against. As Omar knows better than anybody else, there's the anti-usury teaching, the anti-interest charging story within Islam, and indeed also within Taoism in China. There is the tradition in Christian groups, for example, the Quakers never anything to do with armaments, Methodists nothing to do with alcohol. So we've known the sort of the broad remit of what is banned or what is not considered appropriate. And over the last sort of 20 years, there's also grown what's called negative screening. This is, saying, well, we don't want to be involved, for example, in carbon fuels. Big movement there. Most of the major Christian groups have started a process of disinvesting from carbon fuels. But we asked a question, well, we know what you're against. What are you actually for? And for the first time ever, these 550 faith groups around the world, and the finance groups, actually came up with a series of guidelines, written guidelines, based on their theology, their philosophy, their culture, their traditions, which said, this is what we would want to invest in. Some of that is in very detail, very, very detailed. So, for example, the Protestant churches of Germany and the Buddhists of Sri Lanka, very detailed as to what they will invest in. Others are much broader, so the Shinto of Japan, for example, quite a lot of the Christian groups who in a sense have been more used to saying we don't like something than they've been used to saying we think this is a nice idea. More engaged with problems than solutions, if I'd be absolutely frank. We also worked with the UN, ARC, the Alliance of Religions Conservation, with official partners with the UN, to enable the faiths to take part in the new Sustainable Development Goals. This is the 15-year goals to 2030 of the UN. And uniquely, in terms of models of development, the Sustainable Development Goals were launched quite explicitly saying this cannot be done through the traditional grant aid. This has to be done. 90% of the budget that is needed, or the investment that is needed, will have to come from investors, from the business world. And that challenge back to the faiths has been very profound. We hosted a meeting 2015 at which 9 of the major faith traditions said, well, we're thinking about this. And then the UN asked us if we would actually help the faiths to go a step further and actually say what they would invest in. And to our delight, all the major faith traditions that came to the big meeting in Switzerland in October said they wanted this. Then they said they wanted an alliance. They wanted a partnership. In a sense, we've created a completely new demand, Ricky. This is a demand from the faiths of what it is they would like to invest in.
It's a very positive thing. Alison, your reaction to this, and is it timely? Is it something that you've been waiting to happen for a while?
I'm really excited, and what's in the declaration, it's really exciting to see what the work is and what's been done. And as somebody, as you know, who's tried to live in a different way, perhaps more ethically with finance and through our practices within the Iona community, for most of my life with money at least, then the idea that there are going to be more people around who I can talk to about this and who can be exploring these ways of working, I think is fantastic. And not least because I think the focus on what it is we have in common across faith groups. But for me, what is much more exciting even than what we share as faith groups is how this plays into the younger generation, the millennials, the people that I work with most of the time in the universities who have been robbed of their futures, and they can't hope for a world in the same way that many of us have experienced. The welfare state's in tatters, they're not getting permanent jobs, their contracts are terribly precarious, the idea of having a pension, they laugh if I even bring it up. So I think for me what's really exciting is watching, even studying some of the practices of those groups, seeing how they're also learning from other marginalised groups in societies as to how they deal with their money, and bringing the weight of these long, millennia-old traditions of thinking and working and practicing ethically with money actually starts to potentially build a movement that can show there is an alternative, it's alive and well, and we can really share this together and offer it to the future for the young people.
Omar, tell me a little bit about the discussions that went along with this, because you're bringing people together from quite different traditions. What were the bits that you were finding in common ground, and what happened particularly between the Islamic Finance Council and the Church of Scotland? How did all that end up with you in so much accord?
Well, the journey started a number of years back with the roundtable in the House of Lords, which we initiated, which then had the new Archbishop, Justin Welby, join us, along with Rabbi Naftali and representatives from the Church of Scotland and the Islamic faith, and some other faith groups and non-faith individuals. What we did, Ricky, which was fascinating, was we put a bunch of theologians and religious leaders in the room with a bunch of bankers and finance guys. Now you can imagine where this goes. So since then we held another 3 round tables, and we've had some absolute leaders in the financial sector. And what we've managed to do is hold this fine line so this doesn't move into a theological debate, but actually maintains into a very practical conversation.
And were the bankers, the finance people, able to listen? I mean, to really listen to what the theologians and the faith groups were saying, and to hear that their demands were very practical and very real?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that was, I think, the trick of the balance, who was presenting at what point and how that perspective was. So there was a view on the theological basis, and then there was a view on the practical implementations and the challenges. But we all went with one mindset. That mindset was to create a practical, ethical finance solution. So the output of these roundtables is to create a practical solution, which in a way framed the discussion as well and enabled us boundaries, which otherwise sometimes we lose when we have a broad interfaith dialogue.
Sure.
Theologians, I mean, who understands half theologians half the time anyway, with respect, Alison.
Certainly not me.
Yeah, Alison's not calling herself a theologian. But Martin, listening to all this, how did you take what Omar's talking about, these practical discussions in the UK, for example, and how did they have some sort of global significance? Perhaps you can talk us through that.
Well, the movement that I'm involved with, the Faith Consistent Investment Alliance, we didn't know anything about what was happening in Scotland until Omar rang us up a week before the major gathering which we co-hosted with the UN and with major philanthropies around the world and the major faiths. And we were just astonished because what UK Islamic Finance Council and Church of Scotland undertaken was an extraordinary adventure in mutual understanding. Our approach primarily at this stage has been to ask each of the traditions, as I say, over 500, to actually define what their own tradition is. There's often a temptation to try and find the common ground before you've actually worked out what it is that you each bring to an event. We love people to come and tell us why their particular tradition of Hinduism from Puri would have one approach towards forestry, for example, or why a particular school of Taoism in China would have an approach towards business management. We've pulled all those together. We have discovered that there is a great deal more of common ground than we expected. But in the end, what we've actually brought, and by the time we come to Edinburgh and probably base one of the major centres there, will have about 1,000 faith investment groups involved from hundreds of different traditions.
Sure.
Each of them will be doing it because it makes sense to them, but they will be more effective collectively.
Yeah, I understand that, Martin, but tell me this, just this rub between what different faith groups might want. I mean, how did you get round that? I mean, there's conflicting loyalties, and there's some who have no-go areas. I mean, what some might feel is ethical, others might be an anathema to others. So how did you get round those ones?
Well, first of all, by not seeing them as a problem.
Right.
You see, one of our problems, I think, in the West is that we want everything to be unified. If only everybody could be Christians or Democrats or, liberals or whatever it is, capitalists. So we start from the premise that, I come out of the work with religion and ecology. Biodiversity, we know biodiversity is fundamental to evolution. If that's how God works with the natural world, maybe diversity is actually God's gift to us too in the belief systems we have. So we ask each tradition to come proud of their own tradition, but humble enough to listen. Because we're not trying to make them fit into one package.
Alison, you were going to come in there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just listening and thinking that up here in Scotland as well, and you know this, Ricky, that we've learned a lot from the Poverty Truth Commission and from our own work as commissioners within that, and the importance, I think, within these discussions of that word Martin just used of being humble enough to listen. And not to think we've got a solution, but that actually one of the things we need to do, and I know this practically, is learn from those who know how to live with very little and who have found ways of, despite everything, discovering structures that can still give dignity, even in the most intensely impoverished situations. And so I think one of the things I would encourage the movement to start to do is listen hard to women. Women are the ones who deal at the sharp end. Make sure that there are safe spaces within these movements and discussions for women to talk about money and how they deal with it and how they deal with the violence associated with money in so many households, and to look at how faith groups create safe spaces for discussions of money. And certainly in our own practice in the Iona community, learning from women who have thought about money in careful ways and often with very little, but needing to eke it out over a lifetime, and sometimes having grown up in real austerity, has been one of the most humbling things that I've experienced.
Yeah. And Omar, are you satisfied that from your faith perspective, I mean, the people that you're representing are going to get something out of this that has not been there before?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the beauty of this, or somewhat irony, is my background's in the Islamic banking space, which is one of the fastest growing areas within financial services during the time of this crisis, where the rest of banking has retracted to an extent. What we found was interesting was the early attempts at Islamic banking in the 1970s was actually inspired by the savings bank model. And what's beautiful about Scotland, which is from the great Reverend Henry Duncan in 1810. And indeed, the book's just been written on this by Professor Charles Munn, called The Minister of Money. So for us, it was absolutely apt and beautiful in a way that contemporary Islamic banking, which is a $3 trillion plus global industry, and we have brought billions of pounds of FDI into Britain through Islamic banking structures, is actually inspired by a model set up by a church minister 200 years ago here in Scotland. So
squaring the circle. But finally, Martin, let's talk also about Scotland, because you mentioned and you hinted that potentially it's a huge thing for Scotland and particularly for Edinburgh. Is it going to happen here? Is that going to be located in Scotland?
That is the goal. We have a major meeting of all our partners, UN, national governments, faith investment groups, secular investment managers, philanthropists, NGOs, you name them, in New York at the end of March. And in our discussions with the UNDP, who want to set up a faith-consistent investing unit within the United Nations to work with the faiths as potential investors in the Sustainable Development Goals. They have gone to the government of Norway to ask for funding. Norway have said, well, we'd love to fund this, but we don't want to be seen to be doing this alone. Through Omar's amazing contacts and delightful people that he has, we are in discussion at this stage, very early discussion, with the Scottish Government and with the Edinburgh Council to look at whether this could be a partnership between the United Nations, Norway, Scotland, Edinburgh, and ourselves. And having been to see the wonderful space that Omar somehow has managed to get his hands on, we really do feel that this would be a tremendous place to come. We can look up the hill and see the home of Adam Smith, who could be laid as the sort of the prophet who got us into all this trouble in the first place, or could be the person who just got basically misunderstood. And I think
That's a whole other discussion.
It's a very long discussion. Well, we're going to explore that, I hope. But I think the main thing is that I've heard all my life about the Scottish Enlightenment, and I have to say, sitting with Omar's group, we had about 40 people meeting over lunch. Hearing them talking there was absolutely fascinating. I can see what is meant by that. It's this richness of ideas, richness of people who are willing, from the most senior positions, to talk about what they personally think is important. If we can do that, that will make a change to finance alone.
Well, thank you so much, Martin Palmer, Omar Shaikh, who's quietly blushing in the corner, and Alison Phipps. Martin and Alison, you're staying on for a little longer. We'll be discussing the divine feminine right after this by my very special guest next Sunday morning.